Music's a really big realm. It reaches a lot of people. And Mark has a fantastic book that actually goes into this. It's kind of a heavy book. It's a big book, but this is a big subject. Music. This is how something reaches us. I love music. I love music, but I'm very careful about the music that I listen to these days. I really am. There's a lot of music that won't reach my ears ever because I'm careful and I'm scared about what the powers that be are doing to the music industry and what a provocative industry it is. Without further ado, Mark Devlin, Musical Truth.
Thanks, Mary. And it's great to be back. I was at the Free Your Mind conference last year. And once again, mine is the token English accent at the conference. And I did all the jokes last year about wanting a cup of tea and saying bloody a lot, so I can't do those now. You won't hear me bigging up the Queen of England very much, like a lot of my country folk unfortunately still do. I may be making reference to her in other aspects, but it won't be very respectful. Anyway, as Mary mentioned, I've put out a book called Musical Truth, which has come out in the months since I was last here. It brings together everything I've come to understand about how the corporate music industry is used for some very nefarious and malevolent agendas. And there's all kinds of stuff going on behind the glossy surface that most people have absolutely no idea of. So the book is 5 years' worth of research since I first got put on this path, and it brings together everything that I've uncovered in that time. It took 13 months to write, it's 170,000 words, and it's 536 pages, so it's a bit of a doorstop. And I would love to relate all the different aspects of what I've come to discover to you today, but if I did, we'd be here till about 2 o'clock in the morning, literally. One day, I hope to do an all-day seminar in the style of David Icke, where I can unpack all this stuff and all the nuts and bolts and all the tactics and methods that are used. But for today, like everyone else, I've got a very condensed version of the whole story. So I'm hoping that it makes sense. It's going to be a talk of 2 parts. The first part consists of a bunch of tidbits and information that I think you'll find very interesting. The second part goes into some more metaphysical and spiritual realms and tries to make sense of why all this stuff is being done. And we also get into some solutions. So first off, I came to discover in my early research that throughout the history of the corporate music industry on both sides of the Atlantic, there are some common denominators, some factors that have been present decade after decade throughout behind the scenes. And they're all the kind of thing that you wouldn't necessarily expect to find connected to music. One of the main ones is connections everywhere to military intelligence, family connections between prominent music artists and professions in military intelligence or the secret services or some other aspect of government departments. We also have, unfortunately, paedophilia everywhere and satanic ritual abuse of the type we heard Jay Parker and Kathy O'Brien talking about yesterday. Also everywhere is trauma-based mind control, Satanism and dark occult rituals. Another thing that you find, particularly on the British side of things, is a whole load of lords and sirs that have been knighted by the aforementioned Queen of England. And you can ask yourself what any of this stuff has to do with the music industry if it's all about entertainment, having fun, letting your hair down at the weekend, going out to the club and just enjoying yourself, which is what we all imagine the music industry to be all about. So why are all these other elements present? Well, they are. When you get to the British side of things, another character that you see cropping up time and time again is this guy on the right, Jimmy Savile. I'm not sure how up on Jimmy Savile folk in the US are, but trust me, everyone in the UK knows about this guy. He was exposed just over 4 years ago as having been a serial paedophile, child rapist, necrophiliac, and possibly killer over the course of about 50 years. And during all that time, this guy worked as a DJ and a television presenter for the BBC. Those nice people. We'll be getting into the BBC. But you find out that Savile had connections to just about everybody. And another very pertinent question would be, why should that be? So here he is with Cliff Richard. And there's lots to say about Cliff Richard, but there's still a couple of legal cases open about him where he's being investigated by police in Britain connected to child sexual assault charges. And because these cases are still open, we can't say too much about it, but it's kind of interesting that they're there in the first place. And this does tend to fly in the face of the wholesome, family-friendly Christian image that we've had of Cliff Richard for all these years. So here he is with Jimmy Savile, and it does look like he's bloody hypnotising him with a pendulum, which is kind of interesting in itself. Here we have Jimmy Savile with Paul McCartney, or is it? Delighted to hear Jay Parker get into this one yesterday, because there's a whole load of researchers coming on board with this now, and we'll touch on that briefly as we go on. This was at the release of the Beatles album Sgt. Pepper. You can see Savile's holding a copy of it there. So Savile was associated with the Rolling Stones as well. Here he is with a young Mick Jagger. And here he is with Elvis Presley. So he really did move in these circles on both sides of the Atlantic, and he seems to have been affiliated with all the key players of the day. So Savile, as I mentioned, was very closely associated with the BBC. And there's lots to know about the BBC when you really get down to it. They've been in the headlines a lot in the last few years, particularly since all these revelations about Savile's historic paedophilia broke. And the BBC is a propaganda arm for the British establishment, basically. A mouthpiece for the British government, and with very strong links to MI5, MI6, the security services. Unfortunately, it also has a lot of links with paedophilia. And we're going to get into the concept of the controllers, the manipulators' favourite tactic of placing the truth of what's happening in a situation in plain sight as we go on as well. It is a favourite method of theirs, and outside the BBC's iconic broadcasting house in London, you've got this statue. It's called Ariel and Prospo. And as you can see, it seems to depict an adult male sort of writhing in ecstasy as a young male child, naked, writhes against his crotch. So what is that designed to tell us, and what is it doing outside the BBC's flagship building? We're back to Savile. For many years, and this is ongoing, the BBC have had an annual money grab called Children in Need. And the public face of it basically states that there are a whole bunch of children from disadvantaged backgrounds and that have suffered abuse of various kinds, and they all need our help, people. They all need your money to make their lives better. So every November, they roll out this big charity event on TV. And for many years, they put Savile out there as the public face of it. Talk about taking the piss. Talk about rubbing your nose in it. And talk about putting the truth right there in plain sight. But nevertheless, that is what happened. And you can see in the background here, you've got the mascot, the motif that has always been used for children in need. And it's a teddy bear by the name of Pudsey. When you get into the area of trauma-based mind control, MK Ultra and Monarch programming, there are various symbols that crop up all the time that give visual indicators as to the presence of mind control programming. One of them is a teddy bear, and often you see a teddy bear with mutilated or broken limbs, like an arm missing or an eye missing, such as we have here. And what that's intended to symbolize is the broken childhood of the victim, because they get many of these victims from early childhood, and they take these precious kind of icons of childhood innocence, such as teddy bears or dolls, and they present them in a fractured, broken kind of way, which symbolizes the broken innocence of childhood that's taken place with the victim. And I find it very interesting that the logo for BBC Children in Need is a teddy bear of this variety, and also he has a bandage across his eye, meaning one eye is covered, and that's also some very interesting symbolism when you get down to the language of it. Also, Pudsey Bear, in the early days, appeared inside a pyramid, which is another very interesting piece of symbolism. But it wasn't just Savile that they used to parade on Children in Need with this bear icon. This guy on the right, not to confuse him with Gary Davis, the DJ there, is Gary Glitter. And Gary Glitter, I tell you what, you know something's gone wrong with your life when your name gets used as rhyming slang for a toilet. Because Gary Glitter is kind of slang for the shitter, you know. So what has happened in your life when that occurs? But Gary Glitter could be said to be very much ahead of his time, because before Jimmy Savile and all these other BBC personalities were exposed as child rapists, Gary Glitter got done in the early 2000s on similar charges. And he's had multiple cases against him. He's been in and out of jail. I think he's out at the moment, but his is not a pretty life story at all. So here he's been wheeled out as a public face of Children in Need when he is one of many perpetrators who are putting the children in need in the first place. I can't help thinking that if the BBC and its various schemes and its various personalities didn't exist, there wouldn't be quite so many children in need. Rolf Harris is another one, long-time BBC television presenter. Here he is on stage with a massive Pudsey Bear, and he's yet another convicted paedophile now that's been wheeled out as the public face of this disgusting organisation. We're going back a minute here to Cliff Richard and some of the other connections. The guy that he's pictured with here is a Tory peer by the name of Lord Boothby. I told you we'd meet some lords and sirs along the way. And Cliff Richard was closely associated with him. There's been much speculation as to what the nature of their relationship was. Anyone that's seen the movie that came out recently called Legend, which is all about the Cray twins, starring Tom Hardy, there's a depiction of Lord Boothby in that movie, and he doesn't come across too well, let me tell you. And he was closely associated with Cliff Richard in many ways, as I say. The Cray twins themselves, when you delve into the murky underbelly of it all, were very much tied into the British music industry of the 1960s. And there have been many researchers that have suggested that the Cray twins were actually involved in procuring children for paedophile rings that were used by the rich and famous and the establishment of the day. These two were notorious East End gangsters in London, and they're pretty legendary figures in the UK. I suppose they're like the UK version of Charlie Manson, really. And there are connections everywhere between the Crays and Jimmy Savile and Cliff Richard and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. It's just incredible, this interconnected labyrinth of connections that you see everywhere you look. And looking a bit like a boiled egg is this fella. And probably most people in the room are familiar with who he is and the sort of stuff that he used to get up to. It's the notorious occultist Aleister Crowley. And he crops up time and time again in the backstory of the music industry, again, on both sides of the Atlantic. And Aleister Crowley was involved with ritual magic and, ceremonial rituals of one degree or another, and, some very dark occult activities. So what the hell is this guy doing within the entertainment industry? Why is he revered by so many artists? Why does he crop up so many times in all these mazes of information that you can go through, and which I detail in the book? Nevertheless, he is. Most famously, he appeared on the sleeve of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album, up there in the top corner. And the Beatles at the time said, we're featuring all our heroes, all our icons. And there's some very suspect characters in there, and Crowley is one of them. But Aleister Crowley seems to have held an absolute fascination for musicians over the decades that have absolutely revered his works, and in many cases they've involved themselves in them in a very close way. One of them, very famously, is Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin. And here he is, pictured outside Crowley's famous residence, known as Boleskine House. This is on the shores of Loch Ness in Scotland. And Crowley is said to have performed many a ritual there, and he's said to have summoned up various off-world entities and not adequately sent them away again. So there's all kinds of legends and stories connected with Boleskine House. And Jimmy Page, with this infatuation that he had for the works of Crowley, bought the place in 1971 and lived there on and off until 1991 when he sold it. Such was his fascination with the works of Crowley. That's not all Jimmy Page was into either. And going back to one of these common elements that I said was everywhere within the entertainment industry, we come back to paedophilia. And here's Jimmy Page pictured with a 14-year-old girl by the name of Laurie Maddox. And her nickname was Lightning Laurie. And she was a rock music groupie in the late 60s, early 70s. And Jimmy Page is said to have had an affair with her, ongoing for several months, when he was already in a relationship with another groupie, another underage fan of the group. So whichever way you cut it, sex with 14-year-old girls is paedophilia. And we have another element of that going on here. It's very much common knowledge that Jimmy Page was involved with Laurie Maddox, but as far as I'm aware, there's been no legal action taken against him at all, even in light of all these other revelations that we've had coming out, which would suggest that maybe he has friends in high places. Who knows? It also turns out that Jimmy Page is not the only one to have been there when it comes to this particular girl, because in an interview that she gave with another rock music groupie by the name of Pamela Des Barres, many years later for a TV documentary, she revealed that before she'd taken up with Jimmy Page, she was deflowered, as she tells it, by another very famous rock musician by the name of David Bowie. Her words. Not to be outdone by the Beatles in terms of all the esoteric and kind of occultic imagery going into their record sleeves were the Rolling Stones. And it's interesting to reflect that the two very biggest music acts of the 60s, and some would say in rock music history, are the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. And when you get into the backstory of both of these groups, there's no shortage of information, and all those elements that I mentioned at the start are present in the stories of both of these groups. So did these two evolve to become the two biggest and most influential groups of their time by accident, by random chance? Was it just some organic thing? Or were there hidden forces behind the scenes that saw to it that these two became the two biggest groups of their time, and that they wouldn't leave that sort of thing to chance because they want to be in control of who exactly gets up there on that public pedestal? So this is the sleeve to a very interestingly titled Rolling Stones album called Their Satanic Majesty's Request. And it's quite similar in nature to the Sgt. Pepper sleeve. It was kind of a homage to that. And you've got everything on there. You've got a depiction of the planet Saturn, blood red, hovering ominously overhead. You've got Mick Jagger in a wizard's suit. All kinds of interesting stuff to get into there. All kinds of interesting stuff to get into with the Stones generally. And one of the themes that I've explored is this concept of sudden death, which seems to have followed the group around through the ages. And you could take it right back to the Rolling Stones' performance at Altamont, the Altamont Festival in California in 1967. And what happened there was a young black 18-year-old by the name of Meredith Hunter. And you can see in the image here, the arrow is pointing him out in this distinctive green jacket. And while the Rolling Stones were performing on stage at this concert with Hell's Angels doing the security for some reason, they weren't very effective, this young kid was stabbed to death right in front of the stage as the Stones performed. And it's led many to speculate on whether this was some kind of dark occult ritual which the group were privy to. But either way, it's a pretty horrific thing to happen at a rock concert. And it's not the only appearance of sudden death, as I say, that's followed the Stones around. The Rolling Stones had a very close working relationship with a satanic filmmaker by the name of Kenneth Anger, working out of Los Angeles. His real name was Kenneth Engelmeyer. He's still alive, actually, and I think he's still making films. He's in his 80s now. But back in the 1960s, the Rolling Stones were very closely associated with this guy. And his speciality was short movies full of very striking, iconic imagery, all spliced together very quickly. His two most famous movies were called Lucifer Rising and Invocation of My Demon Brother. And Mick Jagger was involved in both the movies. He provided the soundtrack to Demon Brother. And when it came to the soundtrack to Lucifer Rising, Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin, who was also associated very closely with the Rolling Stones in their early days, was chosen to do the original soundtrack. But his wasn't used in the final cut of the movie. That privilege went to a guy named Bobby Beausoleil, who is famous for having been one of Charles Manson's disciples. And Beausoleil was jailed for life back in the late 60s for stabbing to death a music teacher by the name of Gary Hinman. And for some reason, Kenneth Anger, of all the other musicians that he could have used to compose the soundtrack to this movie, decided it had to be Bobby Beausoleil. And so he composed the soundtrack from his jail cell, and that's the one that was used for the movie. This is a still from Lucifer Rising, and it features Marianne Faithfull, who, along with Anita Pallenberg, was one of the two women that was very closely associated with the Rolling Stones' inner circle. And many researchers have asked whether they were mind control subjects that were kind of sent into the group. Many have questioned whether they were sort of sex slaves. You know, the debate remains open as to what their true role was. But Marianne Faithfull was utilised in this movie anyway. Here she is in front of the Great Pyramid in Egypt in a very striking piece of imagery, typical of Kenneth Anger. The Rolling Stones' founding member was not Mick Jagger or Keith Richards. It was this guy, Brian Jones. And his story is fascinating in itself. Brian Jones died at the age of 27, and so he was a very early member of the 27 Club, which has already been referenced in this conference, and which I'm sure many people are familiar with. This is the large number of musicians that just happen to have turned up dead in suspicious circumstances at the age of 27. So you've got Jimi Hendrix, you've got Jim Morrison, Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, Amy Winehouse, Kurt Cobain, Janis Joplin, of course, Robert Johnson, the blues musician, and a whole bunch of others that I've forgotten. But when it comes to strange circumstances surrounding Brian Jones's death, he was discovered floating face down in the swimming pool of his Sussex house in the south of England on the 3rd of July, 1969. And this just happens to be 2 years to the day before Jim Morrison was discovered unconscious in a bathtub in his Paris apartment on the 3rd of July, 1971. Interesting date. This is Brian Jones leaving a court case for a drugs bust in London in 1967. And if you look real hard at the registration plate on the car in which he left, you can see that you get the number 666. It's a very interesting number. It's not the first time that we'll encounter it in this story, and it's another element that crops up time and time again everywhere you look. And we have further links to military intelligence family backgrounds when it comes to Brian Jones, because it turns out his father was an aeronautical engineer working for various government departments. And the family moved from Wales to Cheltenham when Brian Jones was very young. And Cheltenham just happened to be the location for GCHQ, which is Government Communication Headquarters. It's basically the UK's version of the NSA, and it's all involved with spying and surveillance. This is what the building looks like in Cheltenham. Very interesting design, I'm sure you'd agree. And anyone that studied symbolism connected to Saturn will probably find this one quite potent. More links to military intelligence with this guy, who came across my radar quite recently. His name is Miles Copeland. And he had 3 sons who each started their own companies connected with the music industry. You can see he's wearing a T-shirt there which says IRS. And so one of his sons started a music management company. I forget what the full name of it was, but when you abbreviate it to the initials, it becomes IRS. One of his other sons started a company which, abbreviated, turns into FBI. And one of his other sons was Stuart Copeland of the group The Police. So it turns out Miles Copeland was a big-time career CIA man. And I think there's a lot of symbolic relevance to the fact that his three sons, who each went to work in the music industry, started organizations known as IRS, the FBI, and the police. Do you ever get the feeling they're taking the piss? The information about Miles Copeland, along with so much more, came across my radar thanks to this guy. Give it up for Dave McGowan. Great. A journalist and researcher by the name of Dave McGowan, who came out of Los Angeles, did a lot of great and invaluable work in uncovering the connections between key music industry icons and, once again, these family backgrounds in military intelligence. This was his master work, which he managed to get out just a couple of years before he unfortunately passed away last year on the 22nd of November, which, of course, is the anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. So Dave contracted cancer, tragically, and it got very aggressive towards the end, and he died very quickly. But it did happen to be on that date. I can't say whether there was any foul play involved or not. I really don't know. But inevitably, it's led to speculation to that degree, given the interesting date on which he finally passed. But this was his book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. And it's all about this neighborhood in Los Angeles known as Laurel Canyon. And out of this neighborhood, in the latter half of the 1960s, emerged pretty much all the key players in what came to be known as the hippie scene, the counterculture, anti-establishment scene of that time. The music that emerged came to be known as folk rock, and it changed the face of music that young people were listening to in the 1960s. And we're talking many of the prominent acts of that time who just happened to have emerged out of this very small neighborhood in Los Angeles, which prior to this time had absolutely no musical history at all. And McGowan points out that almost overnight, around about 1965, 66, you started to get recording studios popping up, there were music clubs, and there were all these musicians that were flocking to this area from all around the United States. They were coming from Canada, they were coming from overseas, like the UK, and so you had acts like the Mamas and the Papas and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, the Byrds, the Eagles, the Doors, Joni Mitchell, Joan Baez, Buffalo Springfield, Captain Beefheart, a whole load of others. And McGowan's research uncovered that almost without exception, when you delve into the family backgrounds of the fathers, you find links to military intelligence, the CIA, the FBI, and various other government departments. The absolute classic one which he uncovered was the father of Jim Morrison of the Doors. And this is an incredible photograph taken on the bridge of Jim Morrison's dad's ship. Jim Morrison's dad turned out to be this guy, Admiral George Stephen Morrison. And there's a young Jim Morrison on the bridge of his ship from January 1964. And Admiral Morrison turns out to have been the naval commander on deck on the fleet of ships that was involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident, or false flag incident, which basically started America's bloody ground war in Vietnam. So what we have is the father of an iconic rock god whose image stood for anti-establishment, anti-war, sticking it to the man, turns out to be the son of the man who basically kick-started America's involvement in the Vietnam War. Absolutely incredible. And so McGowan went further into so many of these other artists. Frank Zappa is another one. Frank Zappa was actually born on the Edgewood Arsenal military base, and his father was involved in chemical bioweapons research, which is a very far cry from the image that you have of Frank Zappa as another hero of this movement. Frank Zappa's wife, Gail Sloatman, went to naval kindergarten with a young Jim Morrison. They were together when they were very young, and then 20 years later, they both turn up in Laurel Canyon, him as a larger-than-life iconic rock god, and her as the wife of another one. And as McGowan pointed out to me in an interview that I did with him, you don't find a stranger juxtaposition between father and son than between Jim Morrison and his dad and Frank Zappa and his dad. There was all kinds of other stuff going on in that latter half of the 1960s, which kind of fed into the music scene that was coming out of Laurel Canyon. You had the emergence of LSD, largely at the hands of this guy, Dr. Timothy Leary, who on the face of it appeared to be this real funky, groovy Harvard professor that had discovered this amazing way to explore your consciousness and go on a journey of self-discovery. And he was pitching this to the kids at the time, saying, you know, hey kids, turn on, tune in, drop out, and let's all go on this amazing journey together. It all tied in with the music, which sounded very different to anything that had gone before it. And then, of course, you come to realize, by his own admission in his later years, that Timothy Leary himself was a CIA asset and had worked with them for many years. And another CIA asset who was also involved in that whole scene was a guy by the name of Ken Kesey. You had Ken Kesey in his Merry Pranksters, which was this group that used to ride around California in this psychedelic, multicolored bus, distributing free tabs of acid to all the kids that were hanging out in Haight-Ashbury and all these other areas. So all of these revelations regarding links back to military intelligence and specifically the CIA call into question how organic and natural and grassroots that whole music scene in the latter half of the 60s actually was. We've been led to believe that the hippie movement came out of dissatisfaction with the establishment, anti-war feelings regarding Vietnam, and just kids wanting to express themselves in this wonderful new way. But in the light of this new evidence, much of which is only coming to light now, we get a very different picture, which is that there was manipulation and direction and control going on all the time at every level. Other stuff happening in the 60s, the Manson family murders. Charlie Manson and his disciples were very heavily connected into an organization known as the Process Church of the Final Judgment. And that organization has very strong links to David Berkowitz, who was the son of Sam Killer. So again, serial killers, dark occult stuff. What has any of this got to do with music if music is all about having fun? We also had the Church of Satan established in 1966 by the high priest here, Anton LaVey. And 66 was a very interesting year because we go back to something I touched on earlier, which is the Paul McCartney replacement theory. Although, according to many, it's no longer a theory, and it's basically been proved, as far as it can ever be proved, that the person we think of today as Paul McCartney is not the original James Paul McCartney. And for anyone to have memories of the original McCartney, you would have to be at least 55 years of age. And most people in the world today are under 55 years of age, and so the only perception they have of who Paul McCartney is and what he looks like has been shaped by the character that we've had on the scene since 1966. So according to the story, which is very, very deep, there's a reason why the Paul is Dead chapter is the longest chapter in my book. There's a reason why it's 15,000 words, because you can't do it justice in a sound bite. When you get into it, it's the biggest rabbit hole you'll ever fall down. So I can only touch on it very briefly today. But 1966 is said to be the year when this replacement took place. I would definitely encourage people, if they're new to the subject, to look into it some more. And the record sleeve that is said to offer a symbolic occult clue more than any other is the sleeve to the Beatles album, Abbey Road. As I say, I don't have time to get into it any further than this today, but I'll just leave you with this little thought before we move on. Are these two pictures of the same guy? I'll leave that one with you. Two very iconic movies of the late 60s, laden with occult symbolism and deep hidden meaning. One is Rosemary's Baby, absolutely fascinating, from the director Roman Polanski. Probably the most unsettling, shocking film I've ever seen. far more shocking than The Exorcist or The Omen, because so many aspects of the narrative of that movie are telling the truth about what really goes on in society, and particularly in the entertainment industry. The image poster here absolutely smacks of mind control symbolism, as does this one with the covering of one eye, once again. Rosemary's Baby was set in the Dakota Building in Manhattan, and this is the building outside which John Lennon was assassinated in December 1980. There are loads of synchronistic connections between the movie Rosemary's Baby and Roman Polanski and the Beatles when you get into it. Another very iconic movie, possibly my all-time favorite, is Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. The thing about both these movies is they were released in 1968, but when it comes to Rosemary's Baby, which is all about Satanism, a satanic ring, the lead Satanist character in the movie makes a point of saying that it's 1966. You see a calendar, he says it's 1966, it's year one. It all begins here. There was something very significant about the year 1966 in which so much of this stuff went down. So 2001: A Space Odyssey was in production in 66, it got released in 68, and of all the years that Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke could have chosen as a depiction of the future, for some reason they chose 2001. You might think they would have gone for 2000, being the start of a new millennium, but they went for 2001. Can anyone think of anything that happened in 2001? 66, 2001. We keep bouncing between these 2 years. In 1966, construction started on the World Trade Center towers in New York. 35 years later, 2001, I think we all know what happened. We're getting into the realms now very much of the controllers placing the truth and placing little depictions of what they're doing and what's going on right there in plain sight for those with the eyes to see. They do it in very symbolic encoded form, but they've been doing it forever. And when it comes to predictive programming depictions of what would come to pass on 9/11, where do you want to start? There's hundreds of them. So, the dark, occult, priest class controllers that are directing the entertainment industry, along with all other walks of life, it turns out, like to communicate with each other and with us in terms of our collective subliminal minds by way of various little symbols that they like to put out there. And they've got their favorites. And this is one of them, a young Michael Jackson doing this particular hand signal. He's not the only one to have done it. Here's a more recent image of Beyonce doing exactly the same thing. Here's a whole bunch of manipulated stooges / world leaders doing the same thing. And a few more. And here's what's going on when you really get down to it. The cover story for this is that it means, cool, okay, everything's fine. But within satanic circles, this is a method of communication which is depicting 666, that magic number, once again, and trying to put it across in encoded form that goes straight into the subconscious mind. Here's the headphone range by Dr. Dre. Beats by Dre, the biggest selling headphone out there. It's made Dr. Dre a millionaire. And the advertising imagery for it has a B, which we're told is for Beats, as in Beats for Dre. But when you line up 3 of them side by side, such as in this ad, you get another depiction of 666. It's bloody everywhere. A more recent ad for Drake, the so-called rapper, for, I beg to differ, for his latest single, you get 2 symbols for the price of 1. You've got the 6 going on again, and inside it, you've got an all-seeing eye, which appears to be another favourite. As does this one, the horned hand, as it's known. Here's another bunch of manipulated stooges, including possibly your next president. God, hope not. Doing it. And we see a crossover between the world of politics and business and the entertainment industry when it comes to this particular symbol. Here's Eminem. I could have shown you any number of prominent A-list artists who feel the need to flash this symbol up the whole time. When you get down to the meaning of it, when we're talking about satanic secret societies and dark occult factions, then you come to understand that it's a depiction of Baphomet, this sort of androgynous entity that is a favourite poster child of these dark secret societies that we're talking about. And another favourite is one that Jay-Z is very fond of flashing up, which he calls the rock sign. It's this triangular hand sign that we see everywhere. Here's Kanye West doing it, looking quite mind-controlled, actually, quite dissociated in that picture, and there's a big bloody teddy bear by the side of him as well, so make of that what you will. But Jay-Z claims that it's the rock sign. He claims that he invented it. It's supposed to be a reference to his label, Rockefeller Records. Interesting name. But of course, this hand signal was not invented by Jay-Z. It goes back a very long time into various societies and different cultures around the world. Here's a depiction of Anton LaVey, our old mate from the Church of Satan, doing the same thing in the 60s. Another favourite is covering one eye. The covering of one eye via one method or another. Pretty much every celebrity, household name, A-list artist has done this at some point in recent photo shoots or in videos. And I would ask the question, why should that be? It's all about these favourite signs and symbols that they want to get into the subconscious mind of the collective general public, with most people having absolutely no idea that they're absorbing it and no idea of the meaning and the intent that has been imbued into these symbols before they get put out there. So we were talking about military intelligence, and this is the logo of MI5. Military intelligence is a bit of an oxymoron, really, when you think about it. There ain't too much intelligent about it, but that's what they call it. And so this is the emblem for MI5, who are up to their necks in paedophilia and child abuse themselves when you research that particular area. It's all very much tied into the higher levels of the British establishment, the world of politics, and the world of the royal family when you really get into it. That's a pretty unpopular subject for many, but the truth remains the truth, however unpalatable it might be. So there's the logo for MI5. Here's the logo for a very prominent electronic dance music artist by the name of Paul van Dyk. He's German. He's an immensely successful DJ and producer, known the world over. And for some years now, he's been utilizing this particular logo on his record sleeves and in his videos and such. And I couldn't help noticing that when you put the two side by side, they do tend to bear a bit of a similarity. And I'd scratched my head for years trying to work out what Paul van Dyk's logo was, because it was quite fascinating. There's one picture of it etched into a field, as if it's a crop circle.
It's just upside down.
Yeah, it's been turned upside down, but it's not the only time you see it in electronic dance music. Steve Aoki, Japanese DJ and producer, uses the same thing. And I've got a bunch of images here which show how exactly the same symbolism has been cropping up in the electronic dance music field in recent years, as has been seen in hip-hop and pop music in the years preceding it. It seems they're now doing a number on this particular genre in recognition of the fact that it's so popular and so lapped up by young people the world over. So we've got the covering of one eye, we've got the 6 thing on the eye, another pyramid inside a church. This group was the Freemasons, by the way. Interesting. You actually have a dance music act called MK Ultra. That's their name. And they use a pyramid as well. This is a Nicky Romero video. You've got the pyramid thing going on over the eye. There's a big dance music festival in Belgium called Tomorrowland, and they have a depiction of an eye in the middle of their symbol there. For years, you've had the American dance music producer Eric Murillo that's had an album, a record label called Subliminal, right there in plain sight. I didn't spot it for many years. Talk about subliminal messaging. But we've got, the one eye thing going on there as well, and all kinds of other symbolism. We're back to Jimmy Savile, and we're coming around to the why. Why is it being done? Why do they feel the need to communicate all this stuff to us? Some years ago, Jimmy Savile appeared on, Sir Jimmy Savile. We must give him his proper title. Of course he would be a sir. How could he not be? They called it Betty's Noncing Club. You get a reward for this stuff. So Savile appeared on a TV program hosted by Sir David Frost, and Savile comes on with this caption on his shirt. He says, "I am an animal and I will eat you if I have to." And David Frost says, "What's all this about, Jimmy?" And Jimmy says, "You must give them all fair warning, you see." And this was typical Savile bluster and bullshit, but there's a lot of truth and potency to what he's saying there. Giving them fair warning. And what it ties into is this. This is natural law, universal law, the law of cause and effect, whatever other name you want to put on it, spiritual law. It can be summed up in this very simple phrase, which gets across the central tenet, the central message. Do no harm, but take no shit. It can be expanded. Do not treat others in a way you would not wish to be treated yourself. It's the simplest thing in the world. It's the moral code of creation set into place by the creative force behind the universe, and we, as humans gifted with free will consciousness and the opportunity to make decisions for ourselves, can choose to align ourselves with this simplest of rules, or we can choose to go against it. And we reap the karmic consequence and effects of our actions according to whether we choose to live by this code or not. I'm sure everyone in this room understands that. I would suggest that the dark controllers of the entertainment industry understand this as well. They also understand the concepts of free will and consent. They realize that they too stand to reap the consequences of their actions if they do harm to us. But they seem to think, in their sick, twisted, psychotic mentality, that they can cheat the ordinary karmic consequences of their actions if they get us to consent to what's being done to us. And this is the reason why they place their symbolic clues in everything that they do. They're basically communicating to us in a very cryptic and encoded way what they're all about, what they're doing, what their true nature is. When we don't object to it, when we just absorb all that stuff into the subconscious and have no reaction to it whatsoever, they take that as our implied consent that we're cool with it. And as far as they see it, they've then done no harm. It is a very distorted and sick, twisted way of looking at it, but as I say, we're talking about very sick, distorted, twisted, psychotic individuals. That, I believe, is their perception of it. That is what explains all this symbolism and all this placing stuff right there in plain sight for those with the eyes to see. Undue influence and consent. That's what's going on. So the key to it is understanding what's going on and aligning yourself with the truth of the situation. That's why I think it's so important to communicate to people the methods that are being used in music and in Hollywood films and in TV and in so many other walks of life. When you understand how these symbols work, when you understand why they're there, and when you understand the true nature of those that are placing them there, you have the opportunity to withdraw your consent and to get all this stuff out of the subconscious mind into the conscious mind where it can be understood, so it no longer has the same effect on you. And the next time you see a symbol in a Rihanna video, you're not going to be affected by it because you now understand that it's there. It's very important to communicate this stuff to as many people as possible so that we can break the spell and align ourselves with truth. And that's why I go into it big time in my book. And when you come to an understanding of great truths, you do take on an obligation and a responsibility to communicate those truths to others. And I would encourage everyone listening to this to do just that whenever the opportunity arises. It needs large numbers of people to do it, but it's happening. And as many speakers have told you this weekend and will continue to tell you, the power really does lie with us, nobody else, no excuses. Ours is the generation that has to take on the responsibility for deciding which way humanity goes from this point forward. I love this phrase. If not now, then when? If not you, then who? Now is the time, and any one of us is as good as anybody else to be the ones that do it. And we have the opportunity to continue to go down the road towards total spiritual, mental, physical enslavement that we're being steered down at a very rapid rate, or to go the other fork in the road, which is turning things around and manifesting the kind of future that we want and that we want to leave behind to our kids. The choice really is ours, and the time really is now. Thanks so much. Thank you very much. I just wanted to finish by mentioning that I have copies of the book out there for anyone that wants them. It goes into a whole world of information that I couldn't in this talk. Thank you for listening. It's been a blast. Thank you.